I found them in September, during the archive reorganization that no one thought would yield anything but dust and obsolete cadastral records. The Vatican's secret archives, now renamed the Apostolic Archives, in a gesture toward transparency that fooled absolutely no one, had assigned me to Section 17, Subsection 4, Ecclesiastical Tribunals, 1580 to 1650. The letters were wedged behind a false backing in a wooden filing cabinet that predated the current cataloging system by at least a century. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide them there, and even more trouble to make sure they looked like they belonged to the general chaos of poorly maintained records from that era. The first letter I opened was dated March 15, 1634, written in a cramped, desperate hand. Most Holy Eminence, I write to you in confidence and in fear. The Sisters of San Teodoro are not guilty of the crimes attributed to them. I know this because I was present at the tribunal. What we discovered there, what we were ordered to conceal, weighs upon my soul like a millstone. 3 of the sisters have now vanished, just as Sister Agnes warned they would. We were told they were transferred, but Your Eminence, I have made inquiries. They arrived at no other convent. They simply disappeared after the investigation concluded. I can no longer remain silent. The Church accuses these women of heresy to hide its own sins. God sees all, even what we bury beneath sealed documents and false testimony. May the Lord have mercy on us all. Fr. Matteo Vincenzo, Secretary to the Holy Office. My hands trembled as I read. I'd been working in these archives for 7 years, processing the bureaucratic detritus of centuries, and never had I encountered anything like this. The other letters, 17 in total, were from different hands, different years, but all circled the same dark star: the convent of San Teodoro and the secret tribunal of 1634. I should have reported my finding to Monsignor Baldini immediately. Protocol demanded it. Instead, I photographed every page with my phone, carefully replaced the letters, and went home to my tiny apartment in Trastevere to read them properly. The convent of San Teodoro stood in the hills northeast of Rome, a day's journey by horse in the 1600s. According to the surviving records I could access through official channels, it had been a small community of Benedictine nuns, perhaps 30 sisters at its peak. In 1634, it was formally investigated by a special tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition on charges of heresy, witchcraft, and demonic possession. The tribunal consisted of 3 judges: Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio, Bishop Alessandro Borghese, and Father Inquisitor Domenico Sartini. Their secretary was the Father Matteo Vincenzo, who had written that first desperate letter. The official record stated that the investigation had concluded with the convent's dissolution. The nuns were dispersed to other communities throughout the Papal States. The building itself was deconsecrated and later collapsed in an earthquake. End of story. Except it wasn't the end. The second letter I read was from a notary named Paolo Griffi, dated August 1634, 5 months after the tribunal concluded. Brother Tommaso, I write this in cipher, as you taught me, for I fear regular post is watched. You asked me to confirm the whereabouts of the nuns from San Teodoro. I have now visited every convent within 50 miles to which they were supposedly sent. Brother, they are nowhere. The Mother Superiors at each location have no record of any transfers in 1634. When I pressed them, showing the official documents, they grew frightened and asked me to leave. More disturbing, yesterday a man came to my office asking questions about my recent travels. He wore no identifying garments, but I recognized the bearing of a papal guard. He knew I had been to the convents. He knew which ones. I am destroying my notes. I suggest you do the same with this letter. Whatever happened at San Teodoro, powerful forces wish it to remain hidden. I spent 3 nights reading and rereading the letters, cross-referencing them with what few official documents existed. A picture began to emerge, fractured, incomplete, but deeply troubling. One letter, the longest, came from Cardinal Campeggio himself, written in 1637, 3 years after the events. It was addressed to no one, perhaps never intended to be sent. I write this as confession, though I know no earthly priest can absolve what we have done. Let this document serve as testimony before God, since I have not the courage to testify before men. We arrived at San Teodoro on March 3, 1634, with full authority from Pope Urban VIII to investigate allegations of heretical practices. The accusations came from a Monsignor Vittorio Sanson, who claimed to have witnessed disturbing activities during a visit to deliver last rites to an elderly sister. He described rituals performed at midnight, strange Latin chants that were not from any approved liturgy, and symbols carved into the walls of the chapel that suggested occult practices. Most damningly, he claimed the nuns were in possession of forbidden text works of Gnostic heresy and perhaps even earlier, pagan sources. I confess, I arrived expecting to find a coven of confused women who had perhaps strayed into superstition. What we found was far different. The Mother Superior, Sister Agnes, was a woman of perhaps 50 years, stern but learned. When we presented the charges, she did not weep or protest as one might expect. Instead, she said, "The church has finally come for us, then." I knew it would, though not why. Why would you say such a thing? I demanded. "Do you confess to heresy?" "We confess to nothing," she replied. "But we know too much, and that has always been dangerous." Cardinal Campeggio's letter continued for pages, describing the initial investigation. The tribunal had found the forbidden text's ancient manuscripts, some in languages none of them could read. The nuns admitted to studying them, but claimed they were researching early Christian practices, trying to understand the primitive church before centuries of doctrine accumulated. "We sought only to know how the first followers of Christ lived and worshipped," Sister Agnes told the tribunal. "The texts we possess were here long before any of us took vows. This convent was built on older foundations. When we excavated the crypt for repairs 10 years ago, we found a chamber pre-Christian, we believe. These documents were preserved there, sealed in pottery jars." Bishop Borghese grew angry at this. "And you did not report such a find to Rome? You took it upon yourselves to study heretical texts without authority." "We reported it," Sister Agnes said quietly. "We sent word to Cardinal Farnese in 1625, as protocol required. We received no reply. We sent a second inquiry in 1627, again, nothing. After the third silence, we understood that we were meant to dispose of the texts ourselves quietly, without further attention, but they had not disposed of the texts, they had studied them. And Father Inquisitor Sartini, who was more scholar than I realized, recognized some of what he saw. From Campeggio's letter, and 3 others written by Matteo Vincenzo, I pieced together what the tribunal had discovered in those strange manuscripts. The texts described a community of early Christians possibly from the 1st or 2nd century who had settled in the hills northeast of Rome. They were refugees, fleeing persecution, but also fleeing from something else, a schism within the early church itself over what would be preserved and what would be forgotten. These Christians possessed writings attributed to women disciples, alternative accounts of Christ's ministry, and theological interpretations that diverged sharply from what would become Orthodox doctrine. They were not Gnostics, exactly, or if they were, they represented a branch of Gnostic thought that history had utterly erased. The nuns of San Teodoro, in studying these texts, had stumbled onto evidence that the early church had been far more diverse, far more contentious, and far more willing to suppress competing visions of Christianity than the official histories acknowledged. The texts speak of deliberate destruction, Sister Agnes told the tribunal. Communities of believers, branded as heretics, eliminated not for false teachings, but for true ones that threatened the emerging hierarchy. Records burned, people vanished. It describes methods of making dissent disappear that are. Your Eminence, they are uncomfortably familiar. Father Vincenzo's letter from April 10, 1634 recorded what happened next. The mood in the tribunal chamber changed after Sister Agnes made that statement. Cardinal Campeggio called for a recess. He and Bishop Borghese and Father Inquisitor Sartini withdrew to private conference for more than an hour. When they returned, the cardinal's face was grave. He asked Sister Agnes directly, "Have you shared your findings with anyone outside this community?" "No, Your Eminence, we understood the sensitivity. Have any of these texts left the convent?" "Never. We have been most careful." The cardinal nodded slowly. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "That is fortunate. Very fortunate indeed." What happened next was described in fragments across multiple letters, as if the horror of it made complete recounting impossible. The tribunal did not conclude with charges of heresy. Instead, after that private conference, Cardinal Campeggio announced that the texts would be confiscated and brought to Rome for proper analysis by qualified scholars. The nuns were to be interviewed individually about their understanding of what they'd read. Those interviews took place over 3 days. Each sister was questioned separately, their testimony recorded by Father Vincenzo. I found one of his letters that quoted extensively from these sessions. Sister Maria Benedetta, age 26, we believed we were doing holy work. If we erred, we're prepared to accept penance, but I do not believe we erred. The texts speak of Christ's love, of dignity for all believers regardless of station. They speak of women who preached and prophesied with the blessing of the apostles. Is this heresy, or is it history the Church found inconvenient? Sister Lucia, age 34, they will silence us. I see it in their eyes. They have not come to investigate heresy. They have come to bury evidence that the Church's authority was built on suppressing dissent. Sister Agnes, age 51, do what you must, Your Eminence. But know that truth has a way of surviving. You conceal documents, scatter communities, make us disappear from the records. But somewhere, somehow, someone will always find what you've hidden. Perhaps not in my lifetime, perhaps not for centuries. But God preserves what we destroy in ways we cannot imagine. On March 18, 1634, the tribunal officially concluded. The verdict was recorded as, the Sisters of San Teodoro are found to have engaged in unauthorized study of suspect materials, but no formal heresy is proven. The community is to be dissolved, and its members reassigned for their spiritual benefit. Father Vincenzo's letter from that same evening told a different story. They are taking the sisters tonight, not to other convents. Cardinal Campeggio received a sealed order from Rome this afternoon. I saw the papal seal myself. Guards arrived with the sunset, more than would be needed for a simple transfer. I confronted the cardinal, demanding to know where the nuns were being sent. He would not meet my eyes, to places where they can pray and reflect, he said. They will be cared for. They will be buried, I said, alive or dead. You mean to bury them? He struck me then, the only time I have ever seen a prince of the church raise his hand in violence. You will speak of this to no one, he hissed. What we do for the church, for the faith of millions. These women threaten to undermine the foundation of everything we have built. They threaten to tell the truth, I said. There are truths, the cardinal replied, that are too dangerous to be told. Over the following months, according to the letters, several people who had been involved with the San Teodoro tribunal or who had asked questions about its outcome simply vanished. The notary Paolo Griffi, who had investigated the nuns' supposed transfers, was found dead in the Tiber in September 1634. Officially, he had drowned while intoxicated. A letter from his brother suggested otherwise. Paolo did not drink. He feared water after nearly drowning as a child. Yet we are told he stumbled drunk into the river. I do not believe it. I believe he found out too much about where those women were taken. Father Vincenzo himself disappeared in October 1634. His final letter, dated October 3rd, showed he knew what was coming. Brother in Christ, if you receive this, I am already gone. They have summoned me to Rome to discuss my concerns about procedural irregularities. I know what such summons mean. I have seen too many good men answer such calls and never return to their parishes. I have hidden copies of all the testimony from San Teodoro, where I pray they will someday be found. I have failed these women in life, perhaps in death, or long after, their story will be told. The church I love has become the thing it most fears, an institution that preserves itself through the very methods it condemns in others. We persecute heretics while practicing the greatest heresy, the worship of power over truth. May God forgive me for my silence when I should have spoken. And may He preserve what I now hide until the day comes when the Church is strong enough to face its own history. A later letter, from 1639, came from a monk named Brother Giancarlo. He had been a novice at San Teodoro before the investigation. Sent away just weeks before the tribunal arrived, he wrote to a friend, I heard whispers that Mother Agnes and the sisters were sent to a monastery in the mountains San Michele de Rocca, a place for difficult clergy who needed to be removed from public view. I traveled there last month under pretext of pilgrimage. The monastery exists, high in the Apennines, a grim fortress of stone. I was denied entry, but I spoke to a shepherd whose flocks graze nearby. He said that 5 years ago, a group of women arrived under guard. They were housed in the old tower, the part of the monastery that dates to Roman times. He never saw them again after that first night. But for several weeks, he said, he would sometimes hear singing from the tower at dawn. Women's voices, chanting in Latin. Then one morning, silence. When he asked the monks about it, they grew frightened and told him to leave and never return. I do not know if they are dead or merely imprisoned, but I know they are lost to the world as completely as if they had never existed. The longest and most haunting letter was Cardinal Campeggio's, written in 1637, 3 years after the events. It was clear he was dying. The handwriting grew shakier as the pages progressed, and this was his attempt to cleanse his conscience. I justified it to myself with the same arguments I would use before the tribunal on Judgment Day, if God grants me even that mercy. The Church was fragile. The Reformation had torn Christendom apart. Every revelation of internal discord, every hint that our doctrines were not eternal truths but contested decisions, gave ammunition to our enemies. What would have happened if the San Teodoro texts became known? If scholars learned that the early church had been a chaos of competing visions, that women had held authority, that much of what we call heresy was once orthodox belief, the faithful would doubt. Our authority would crumble, so we made a decision. Not in the heat of passion, but coldly, carefully. We took those women to San Michele de Rocca. We took the texts to a vault beneath the Castel Sant'Angelo. And we ensured that no one would ask questions. The sisters were given a choice, though it was no choice at all. They could recant their studies, admit to heresy, and accept lifelong penance in silence. Or they could refuse and be declared apostate, excommunicated, and handed to secular authorities as convicted heretics. Mother Agnes chose the third path. She announced that she and her sisters would accept imprisonment, but would never recant truth. "We will die before we call light darkness," she said. So we imprisoned them in the tower at San Michele, in cells carved from ancient stone. We told ourselves it was merciful we did not burn them, did not torture them, we simply removed them from history. They lived for 2 years in that place. I know because I received reports. The abbot of San Michele wrote to me quarterly. The women prayed, they sang hymns, they maintained their dignity even as their bodies failed in that cold, damp prison. Sister Agnes died first, in the winter of 1635. The others followed over the next year. The last, Sister Maria Benedetta, the young one who had spoken so eloquently at the tribunal, died in March of 1636, exactly 2 years after we first arrived at San Teodoro. They were buried in unmarked graves behind the monastery. I was told a few words were said over them. I was not told what words, and I did not ask. I tell myself we had no choice. But of course we did. We could have brought the texts to Rome, studied them openly, allowed scholars to debate their meaning and significance. We could have trusted that the truth would strengthen rather than weaken the faith. Instead, we chose fear. We chose to protect the institution over the people it was meant to serve. We chose to silence questions rather than answer them. And now I am dying, and I wonder, how many other Sister Agneses have there been? How many other communities of believers who asked inconvenient questions, who preserved inconvenient texts, who were quietly erased from the record? The texts from San Teodoro remain in the vault. I have seen them once since 1634, when I was asked to verify their security. They were wrapped in oilcloth, sealed in iron boxes, catalogued under false headings. They might as well be on the moon for all the chance anyone has of finding them. Unless someone looks in the right place, unless someone asks the right questions. I am leaving this letter with others that document the truth. I am hiding them where I hope they will be found not tomorrow or next year, but someday. When the Church is strong enough to face what we did, when faith no longer requires that we bury our sins along with those we've sinned against, may God have mercy on us all. And may the souls of the Sisters of San Teodoro rest in peace, knowing that their silence was not eternal after all. I sat in my apartment, surrounded by the photographs of these letters, and understood that I was facing the same choice Cardinal Campeggio had faced in 1634, protect the institution, or honor the truth. The next day, I returned to the archives and did something I'd never done before. I requested access to the restricted collections, the materials that required special permission, the documents that were catalogued, but not publicly accessible. I told Monsignor Baldini I was researching ecclesiastical tribunals of the Counter-Reformation period for a scholarly paper. It wasn't entirely a lie. He granted me limited access, enough to search the catalog under specific categories. It took me 3 weeks, but I found it, a reference in a 1638 inventory of the Castel Sant'Angelo vaults. Among listings for confiscated books, seized correspondence, and other materials deemed too sensitive for public archives, there was an entry, Box 147, miscellaneous documents, and texts from dissolved Benedictine community, San Teodoro. Catalogued under Historical Records, Pre-Apostolic Era, Suspected Apocrypha. Sealed by order of Cardinal L. Campeggio, 1634. Access restricted to Prefect of Archives or higher authority. The texts still existed. After nearly 400 years, they were still here, buried in the Vatican's deepest vaults. I spent another month building my case. I drafted a formal research proposal, citing the need to study early Christian communities and their suppression. I argued that enough time had passed that these materials could be examined objectively, without threatening contemporary faith. I even suggested that their study could demonstrate the Church's commitment to historical transparency. My proposal was denied within 2 days. The rejection letter, signed by Baldini, was brief. The materials you reference do not exist in our catalog. Your source appears to be in error. We suggest you focus your research on the extensive resources already available to you. They were gaslighting me. The entry I'd found was still there in the catalog. I checked immediately. But officially, I was being told it didn't exist. That night, I made copies of everything, the photographs of the letters, the catalog entry, my research notes. I uploaded them to multiple cloud storage services, sent encrypted files to colleagues I trusted, even mailed physical copies to 3 different addresses. Then I wrote my own letter to the prefect of the Apostolic Archives, with copies to members of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and several prominent church historians. I have discovered correspondence related to the 1634 investigation of the convent of San Teodoro. These letters, from participants in the tribunal, including Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio, document the suppression of early Christian texts and the imprisonment of nuns who studied them. The texts themselves, according to Vatican inventory records, remain sealed in the vaults beneath Castel Sant'Angelo. I request that these materials be made available for scholarly examination. The events described occurred nearly 4 centuries ago. Whatever threat these texts may have posed in 1634, surely we are now strong enough in our faith to examine our own history honestly. If this request is denied, I will be forced to conclude that the Church continues to prioritize institutional protection over historical truth, and I will make my findings public. The response came not by letter, but in person. Monsignor Baldini appeared at my desk in the archives 2 days later, accompanied by someone I didn't recognize, a thin man in his 60s, wearing the black suit and white collar of a Vatican official. "Dr. Moretti," Baldini said quietly, "this is Monsignor Castellani, from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He would like to speak with you about your recent correspondence." We met in a windowless conference room deep in the administrative wing. Castellani studied me for a long moment before speaking. "You have stumbled onto something that has been deliberately hidden for good reason," he said finally. "Do you understand the implications of what you're asking?" "I understand that the Church imprisoned and possibly killed women whose only crime was studying history," I replied. "I understand that we've lied about it for 400 years. We protected the faith," Castellani said. "In an era when the Church was under existential threat, when every revelation of internal discord was weaponized by our enemies, Cardinal Campeggio and his colleagues made a difficult decision to preserve something greater than individual lives. That's what every institution says when it sacrifices people for power. Is it power to maintain the faith of millions? To preserve a tradition that has brought meaning and salvation to billions of souls over to millennia?" His voice was sharp now. "You speak of truth as if it exists in a vacuum, as if revealing every historical wound serves some higher purpose. But truth without wisdom is simply destruction, and suppression without end is simply tyranny," I shot back. "Those women deserved better. The faithful deserve to know their own history. We can't keep burying our sins and calling it holiness." Castellani was silent for a moment. Then, "What do you want?" "Access to the texts, permission to study them, to publish my findings, and acknowledgement of what happened to the Sisters of San Teodoro. At minimum, their names should be recorded. They should be remembered. And if I tell you that will never happen, that those texts will remain sealed and your findings will be buried just as effectively as Cardinal Campeggio buried his, then I publish what I have," I said. "The letters alone are enough. The world will know what the Church did, even if we continue to hide what those women found." He studied me again, and I saw something unexpected in his eyes, not anger, but weariness, sadness, even. "You realize," he said slowly, "that you're not the first person to discover this story. Every few decades, someone stumbles across some fragment of the San Teodoro affair. And every time, the church must decide how to respond. What usually happens? The researcher is discredited, their findings are suppressed. Sometimes they're offered positions elsewhere, with the understanding that certain topics are no longer to be pursued. It's remarkable how often people choose comfort over truth when given the option. I won't. I believe you. He stood, walked to the door, then paused. I cannot give you access to the texts. That authority rests far above my station. But I can tell you this, you are not wrong about what happened. Cardinal Campeggio's letter, assuming it's authentic, is essentially accurate. The Sisters of San Teodoro were imprisoned for discovering a history we didn't want known. They died in that prison. Their texts remain sealed. Then help me bring the truth to light. I can't. He turned back to face me. But I won't stop you from trying. Make your findings public if you must, accept whatever consequences follow. Perhaps this time will be different. Perhaps the world is finally ready to hear what those women knew. He left. Baldini remained, looking deeply uncomfortable. You're terminated from your position here, effective immediately, he said quietly. I'm sorry, Antonio, truly, but you must understand. I understand perfectly, I interrupted. I'll clear my desk. I published my findings 3 weeks later, in October. Not in a prestigious academic journal, they all rejected the piece within days of submission, but in an online historical forum that had a reputation for controversial scholarship. The article, titled The Lost Sisters of San Teodoro, Ecclesiastical Suppression in the Counter-Reformation, included photographs of all the letters I'd found, along with my analysis of their historical context and implications. The response was immediate and polarizing. Several prominent church historians condemned the article as reckless speculation based on unverified documents. Vatican Radio issued a brief statement noting that allegations regarding events nearly 4 centuries ago, based on letters of uncertain provenance, do not merit official comment, but others picked up the story. First, smaller Catholic publications questioning whether the church was being transparent about its archival holdings. Then mainstream media, framing it as secret Vatican documents reveal history of suppression. Within a month, there was enough public pressure that the Apostolic Archives issued a formal response. Following recent allegations regarding materials in our collection, we can confirm that documents related to the 1634 investigation of the convent of San Teodoro do exist in our archives. These materials, like many others from this period, have been restricted due to their sensitive nature and the need to protect privacy and prevent misinterpretation. The Church acknowledges that in past centuries, mistakes were made in how we addressed internal theological disputes. We are committed to greater transparency and will be establishing a commission to review access policies for historical materials, particularly those related to the Inquisition era. We note that the texts allegedly confiscated from San Teodoro, if they exist in our vaults, would require expert analysis to determine their authenticity and significance. Any suggestion that the Church has deliberately suppressed important religious or historical documents is unfounded. It was a masterpiece of non-denial denial, but it was also an admission that the story was, in essence, true. The commission was duly formed. I was not invited to participate, but several historians I respected were. I heard through back channels that they were granted limited access to materials from the San Teodoro investigation, though apparently not to the texts themselves, which remained under the highest level of restriction. Their preliminary report, published 8 months later, was carefully worded but damning. Evidence suggests that the tribunal of 1634 resulted in the prolonged imprisonment of members of a Benedictine community on charges that would not meet modern standards of due process or proportionality. While the context of the Counter-Reformation must be considered, the treatment of these women appears to have been excessive and unjust. Furthermore, the suppression of documentary evidence related to this case demonstrates a pattern of institutional self-protection that has unfortunately characterized aspects of church governance in past eras. We recommend a formal acknowledgement of these historical failures and a commitment to greater archival transparency going forward. It wasn't everything I'd hoped for, but it was something. The Sisters of San Teodoro were, at least, no longer erased from history. 2 years after my termination from the Vatican Archives, I received an unmarked envelope at my apartment. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief, typed message. The texts from San Teodoro were removed from Castel Sant'Angelo in 1998 during the renovation of the vaults. They were transferred to a secure facility outside Vatican City. I cannot tell you where, but I can tell you this: they have been digitized. Multiple copies exist. The genie cannot be put back in the bottle forever. Your courage has made a difference, not now, perhaps, but someday. Truth survives in ways we cannot predict. A friend I kept that note. I keep all the letters, the photographs, the research, the documentation of my brief time uncovering a story the church wanted to keep buried. I lecture now at a university in Bologna, teaching courses on ecclesiastical history and the politics of memory. My students often ask me if I think the San Teodoro texts will ever be made public. I tell them what I believe: yes, eventually. Because Cardinal Campeggio was right about one thing: truth has a way of surviving. You can seal it in vaults, hide it behind false catalog entries, discredit those who seek it. But somewhere, someone will always be looking. Someone will always be asking questions. The Sisters of San Teodoro asked questions that threatened an institution's carefully constructed history. They were silenced for it, but now, nearly 400 years later, we know their names. We know what happened to them. And we know that the church they served was not strong enough to face the truth they defound. Perhaps we are now. Perhaps that's what it takes: centuries of distance, generations of reckoning with our failures, slow and painful acceptance that institutions built on suppressing truth can never truly serve it. I think of Sister Agnes often, of her final words to the tribunal: truth has a way of surviving. You can seal documents, scatter communities, make us disappear from the records. But somewhere, somehow, someone will always find what you've hidden. She was right. I found them. And now their story is known, or at least the outline of it. The rest, the texts themselves, the full truth of what they contained, remains hidden. But not forever. Nothing stays buried forever. In my desk drawer, I keep a copy of Father Vincenzo's final letter, the one he wrote before his disappearance. I read it sometimes when I need to remember why this work matters. May God preserve what I now hide, until the day comes when the church is strong enough to face its own history. That day hasn't come yet. But I believe it will. I have to believe it. Because if we can't face our history, if we can't acknowledge our failures, honor those we've wronged, and commit to doing better, then what are we? What is any institution that preserves itself by burying its sins? The Sisters of San Teodoro deserved better. They deserved to be heard, to have their scholarship recognized, to live and die with dignity rather than disappearing into unmarked graves behind a mountain monastery. I couldn't give them that. I couldn't save them. Couldn't even truly vindicate them. But I could tell their story. I could make sure they weren't forgotten, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's all we can do with the buried histories we uncover. Bear witness, tell the truth, and trust that it matters, even if it takes 400 years. Even if powerful forces wish it would stay hidden. Even if the full story never comes to light, we tell it anyway. Because the Sisters of San Teodoro, and all the others who were silenced for asking dangerous questions, deserve at least that much. They deserve to be remembered.